On an ordinary sunny afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the peace was suddenly disrupted by the sound of police sirens. A black teenager, barely out of high school, stood frozen in his front yard, confused and scared as two police cars pulled up. He had been doing nothing out of the ordinary, simply shooting hoops in his driveway. But someone in the neighborhood had made a call, claiming he was up to no good. Little did the caller know, their actions would set off a chain of events that would leave the entire neighborhood in shock. This wasn't going to end the way they had imagined. Instead of the police taking the teen away, someone else would show up, a person of authority who wasn't about to let injustice slide. What started as a malicious phone call would soon transform into a powerful lesson about racism, accountability, and the fight for equality. It all began when a longtime resident, Mrs. Parker, looked out her window and saw Jamal, a black teen who had recently moved into the neighborhood. Jamal wasn't doing anything unusual, just practicing basketball moves like any other kid his age. But for Mrs. Parker, who often clutched her pearls at the slightest sight of change, this was enough to make her uncomfortable. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and called the police. "There's a suspicious-looking boy outside," she told the operator, her voice dripping with concern. "I think he's casing houses or something." What Mrs. Parker didn't know, however, was that her call wouldn't just bring officers to the scene. It would bring scrutiny to her actions and expose an ugly truth about the biases that lurk in seemingly quiet, friendly neighborhoods. Jamal, like most teenagers, was just trying to enjoy his day. His family had moved to the area recently, excited about the promise of better schools and a safer environment. That afternoon, he was outside perfecting his basketball skills, hoping to make the varsity team at his new school. When he noticed the police cars arriving, his heart sank. He had done nothing wrong, but he had heard enough stories from his parents and friends to know how situations like these could go. Keeping his hands visible, Jamal stood silently as the officers approached. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked one of them, his voice steady but his heart pounding. The officers, unsure of what to make of the call they had received, began asking questions. Jamal answered politely, but in his mind, one question kept repeating. "Why am I always seen as a threat?" Just as the situation began to escalate, something unexpected happened. A sleek black car pulled up to the scene, and out stepped Mayor Angela Brooks. As the first black mayor of the town, Angela was no stranger to issues of racial bias. She had received a tip-off about the situation and had decided to intervene personally. Walking up to the officers, she introduced herself calmly but firmly. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. The officers, taken aback by her presence, quickly explained the situation. Mrs. Parker, who had come outside to watch the scene unfold, looked on in stunned silence. She hadn't expected the mayor to show up, and she certainly hadn't expected her actions to be questioned so openly. Mayor Brooks wasted no time addressing the elephant in the room. Turning to Mrs. Parker, she asked, "Why did you feel the need to call the police on a teenager playing basketball in his own yard?" Mrs. Parker stammered, trying to justify her actions. "I thought he looked suspicious," she said, avoiding eye contact. "Suspicious? Or simply different from what you're used to?" the mayor pressed. Mrs. Parker's face turned red as her neighbors began to gather, curious about the commotion. Mayor Brooks then spoke to the crowd that had formed. "This is a perfect example of the bias that still exists in our community. Jamal wasn't doing anything wrong, yet someone assumed the worst simply because of the color of his skin. This is unacceptable." Her words hit hard, sparking murmurs among the onlookers. What happened next was a turning point for the entire neighborhood. Mayor Brooks didn't just lecture Mrs. Parker. She also used the moment to educate the community. She explained how calls like this put innocent people in danger and perpetuate harmful stereotypes. Then, addressing Jamal directly, she said, "You belong here just as much as anyone else. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." The crowd nodded in agreement, many visibly moved by her words. Mrs. Parker, realizing the gravity of her actions, offered a shaky apology to Jamal. But the mayor wasn't done. She announced plans to implement community workshops on racial bias and inclusion, ensuring that incidents like this wouldn't happen again. The neighborhood wasn't just going to return to normal, it was going to change for the better. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to shift. People who had once kept to themselves started making an effort to get to know their neighbors. Mrs. Parker, though embarrassed by her actions, joined the workshops and began to unlearn the biases she had carried for years. Jamal, once hesitant to leave his house, now felt more at home. He even started mentoring younger kids in the neighborhood, teaching them basketball and sharing his experiences. Mayor Brooks' intervention became a local legend, a story of hope and transformation. The incident that could have torn the community apart ended up bringing it closer together. And as for Jamal, he made the varsity team, and every time he practiced in his driveway, he did so with confidence, knowing he had the support of a community that had learned the value of justice, equality, and respect.